Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture, which is sponsored by the Philosophy Department and also the Office of the Provost. So thank you, Mr. Provost, wherever you are. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Helen Frowe, who is emerging as one of the leading English-speaking philosophers on the ethics of war and peace and killing. Dr. Frowe completed her PhD in 2007 at the University of Reading in the UK, where she studied with Andrew Williams and Brad Hooker. It's a name that some of my students will recognize. After completing her PhD, she was a visiting fellow at the philosophy department at Harvard, then an early career fellow at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Kent. She's now in the Department of Philosophy at Stockholm University in Sweden, where she's a research fellow at the Wallenberg Academy, which, as far as I can make out, is a bit like Sweden's version of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and where she also directs the Stockholm Center for the Ethics of War and Peace. She's the author of dozens of articles on the ethics of war and killing and self-defense, and she's author or editor of at least 3 books on these topics. So there's Ethics of War and Peace, Routledge 2011. There is How We Fight with Gerald Lang, 2014. There's also Defensive Killing, Oxford University Press 2014. He's much in demand as a speaker and has given scores of lectures at colleges and universities all over the world. And this is not her first visit to Westmont. Those of you who attended the Gady Institute 2013 conversation on war, peace, and liberal arts may remember her striking plenary address on resisting conditional force. Her plan today is to talk for 40 to 50 minutes, after which we'll have perhaps 20 to 30 minutes for question and answer and discussion. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming back to Westmont Dr. Helen Frowe.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much for having me. It's really lovely to be back at Westmont. I feel bad if you bought those books just so you could hold them up. Well, the one looks a little bit dog-eared.
Yeah.
So,
I've actually read this one.
Okay, all right, good. So the topic of the paper today might sound a little bit abstract. We might be wondering which trolley in particular I've got in mind. But at the outset, I just want to sort of do a few remarks to explain exactly what the relevance of these kinds of cases is. So moral philosophers who work on the ethics of killing and just war theory and the ethics of self-defense like I do, typically think that we have, there we go, 4 kinds of justifications for harming people. And of course, it's really harming people that we're interested in when we're thinking about war. That's our primary moral concern in war, is who can we harm and why can we harm them. So the first kind of justification that people tend to give for why we might harm somebody is consent, right? So it might be the case that you're justified in harming me if I've agreed that you can harm me for some reason. So we might have a boxing match or something like that. Now the second kind of justification is what's become known as a liability justification. And this is the kind of justification we might think happens when a person forfeits her usual rights against being harmed. So imagine that I try to culpably stab Mark in the neck. It looks like by posing this culpable threat to him, I forfeit some of my usual rights against being harmed, and Mark would have a right to harm me in self-defense. The third kind of justification we might think of is a desert-based justification. So if I've acted culpably in some way, we might think that I ought to be harmed. I ought to suffer as a form of punishment, right? So this seems like a candidate justification for harming as well. But then, finally, we have what we call lesser evil justifications for harming. And these are justifications that we use to explain why it can sometimes be permissible to harm a person who doesn't meet any of the other conditions, right? So she hasn't consented, she hasn't made herself liable, she hasn't forfeited her rights, and she doesn't deserve to be harmed. Now, roughly, a lesser evil justification for harming obtains when harming a person is necessary for producing a significantly greater good. And when enough good can be secured by harming the person, we might say we're justified in harming her. Now, these kind of justifications are actually pretty common in ordinary life. So we might, for example, invoke a lesser evil justification for building a road that's going to require us to knock down some people's houses. We think that the benefit to the community outweighs the cost to the individuals whose homes we're going to destroy, even though, of course, we might think they should be compensated and so on. The kind of justification that we would give in this case would be a lesser evil justification. It's bad for them if we knock down their houses, but it's so much better for everybody else that we might think we're justified nonetheless in knocking down the houses. Now, lesser evil justifications are also very common in war, and it's this that's really triggered my interest in this topic. So if we think about collateral damage killing of civilians, which is how most people die in war, so combatant casualties are relatively small compared to the number of civilians who are killed in war, and most civilian deaths are justified on grounds of lesser evil. So the idea is that these killings are unavoidable if we're going to secure our just cause, and securing that just cause is just so important, right, preventing a genocide or stopping aggression or whatever, that we justify the deaths to the civilians as the lesser evil. It's not because we think they deserve to be killed, it's not that they consented, it's not that they forfeited their rights. The thought is simply that the disparity between the good and the harm is so great that we're justified in harming these people who have done nothing wrong. Now, this paper is primarily motivated by what strikes me as a tension between the allegedly objective nature of a lesser evil justification. So the idea that these are justifications that track the sort of objective disparity between the good we can achieve and the harm that we're going to inflict. And the common view that agents are permitted not to act on these justifications, that they get to choose whether or not they inflict the harm. So in this paper, I defend what I'm going to call the requirement thesis about lesser evil justifications. And the requirement thesis holds that one is required to act in accordance with lesser evil justifications for harming. And this claim contrasts with what I'm going to take to be the standard view, which I'll call the permissibility thesis, that acting in accordance with these kinds of justifications is usually just merely permissible, and therefore the agent can decide not to act if she wants to. So section 2 of the paper explains the concept of a lesser evil justification in a bit more detail. Section 3 outlines the permissibility thesis and the requirement thesis in the context of a standard Trolley case, and argues that the requirement thesis can withstand some putative counterexamples that seem to come from cases of self-defense or cases of supererogatory rescue. Section 4 considers autonomy-based arguments for the permissibility thesis. And I focus here on some recent work by Alec Wallen and David Wasserman, who claim that forcing an agent to act on lesser evil justifications impermissibly forces her to treat herself as a tool. And then in section 5, I consider some implications of the requirement thesis for the rights of self-defense against those who act with lesser evil justification. Okay, so this is section 2 on the handout, lesser evil justifications. So we normally distinguish in moral philosophy between moral permissions and moral justifications in the following way. So if we say that an action is merely morally permissible, what we mean is that there's no overriding moral reason to do it, but also there's no overriding moral reason not to do it. And lots of actions are like this, right? So it's morally permissible for me to decide to go to Rite Aid instead of CVS, or to drink wine instead of beer, to wear jeans rather than a dress, right? All of these kinds of things seem to fall within the range of what's merely morally permissible. I can do it or I can not do it. Now, of course, the scope of what counts as merely permissible is going to be controversial, because some people think, for example, that eating meat is merely permissible. Other people think it's impermissible. Not many people think it's required. That would be a weird view. But, of course, it's going to be controversial exactly where the boundaries of the merely permissible lie. But when we talk about something as being merely permissible, we usually mean that it's up to the agent to decide. Morality doesn't compel her to act or to refrain from acting. Now, justifications for acting, in contrast, are usually described as permissible, so we have a moral permission, but they're combined with a positive moral reason for acting. And the positive moral reason for acting in a lesser evil justification is, of course, that we're going to secure a really significant good if we act. It's going to be much, so that we'd have this big disparity between the good we can secure and the harm we're going to cause. And lesser evil justifications are therefore objective justifications in the following way, right? They track the facts of the case about the balance of the objective moral reasons, right? They're not about what the agent believes or the agent's evidence. They're objective justifications in the sense that Derek Parfit has talked about, in that they actually track the facts of the matter. And what we're interested in is this difference between the good and the harm. Now, even though lesser evil justifications depend to some extent on the consequences of acting or refraining from acting. It's important to remember that they're not just simple consequentialist justifications. So they're also sensitive to deontological constraints on action. So, for example, they pay attention to the moral significance between doing and allowing. So it's not enough that one will prevent more harm than one causes, which is all you would need on a strictly consequentialist view. To have a lesser evil justification, you have to prevent significantly more harm than you cause in order to overcome the presumptive worseness of causing harm compared to merely allowing harm. And lesser evil justifications are also sensitive to what we call modes of agency. So, for example, whether you're harming a person intentionally or whether you're harming her as a kind of foreseen side effect. And I'm going to assume here that it's easier to justify harming a person as a foreseen side effect, right? The kinds of killings that we see in war of civilians where we don't ordinarily target the civilians, but rather we foresee their deaths as a side effect of attacking some kind of military target. And I'm going to assume that it's easier to justify those kinds of merely foreseen killings rather than compared to cases in which you intentionally target somebody. Now, many rights theorists also distinguish between violating a right and infringing a right. So I violate a person's right if I transgress her right without justification, right? So when I stab Mark in the neck just for fun, right? That doesn't seem like enough of a justification. And so we probably say there that I violate his right. But I permissibly infringe a person's right if I transgress the right with justification. So most people will say that when I have a lesser evil justification, the person has a right not to be harmed, but I infringe that right. I don't violate it because I've got this justification. All right, so it's time for some pictures. So this is what we might call a trolley problem. Now, some of you will be familiar with trolley problems, and this is the sort of standard original trolley case, comes from Philippa Foot. So we've got, I'm going to have to move away from the microwave for a bit. Well, we've got a runaway trolley, and it's heading towards where it's going to kill 5 people. Right? Now, over here we've got a pedestrian who's passing by, and she's standing next to a switch, and she can use the switch to turn the trolley down this way, and then it's going to kill workmen. So she has a choice between doing nothing and letting the trolley hit and kill all 5, or she can intervene and she can flip the switch, and then she can send the trolley down to where it's going to kill workmen. Now, most people endorse the following 3 claims about a case like Trolley. The first is that given the difference in the number of lives and the fact that the harm to workmen is merely foreseen as a side effect, right? She doesn't intend to kill him, she just foresees that when she diverts the trolley, his death's going to be a side effect. Pedestrian has a lesser evil justification for harming. So most people think that she's allowed to flip the switch and kill workmen in order to save the 5. So that's the first claim, that she has a lesser evil justification. Now the second claim that most people endorse is that if she does flip the switch and divert the trolley, then she's permissibly infringed rather than violated workmen's rights, precisely because she acts with justification. The third claim is that pedestrian does not have to flip the switch. So she can permissibly refrain from saving the 5 if she wants to. So call this third claim, the claim that she can decide whether or not to divert the trolley, whether or not to act on the lesser evil justification, the permissibility thesis. And that's the thesis that I want to reject. Now, in contrast, I want to defend what I call the requirement thesis. Now, this holds that if diverting the trolley is justified on lesser evil grounds, pedestrian must divert the trolley. So she may not fail to save the 5 if saving them is a sufficient good to objectively outweigh the harm that she will inflict on workmen. Pedestrian finds herself in a situation in which she can save several people's lives without violating anybody's rights. And I suggest that the 5 have a right to be saved under those circumstances, namely when their being saved doesn't involve violating anyone's rights, nor require a supererogatory sacrifice on the part of pedestrian. Right? It's not asking her to bear a cost which is more than the cost morality can require her to bear. It seems to me that despite the fact that the permissibility thesis has been very widely endorsed, it's a really morally unattractive position when we think about it more closely. So the standard view of a case like Trolley is that harming workman is objectively justified. That is, harming him is permissible and there is a positive moral reason to do it, namely saving 5 lives. And yet the permissibility thesis holds that even though saving the 5 objectively justifies killing the 1, pedestrian may refrain from engaging in this objectively justified rescue if she prefers that the 5 die rather than that she kill the 1. I don't see how one can plausibly hold both that diverting the trolley is objectively justified and that one may permissibly refrain from diverting the trolley. The only reason it seems to me why pedestrian could be permitted to refrain from diverting the trolley is that diverting imposes some cost on her that tips the balance of the objective moral reasons. And this is, after all, how we normally think about our obligations to save. We're required to prevent harm to people, to rescue people, unless doing so imposes too great a cost on us or on some other innocent person. And this includes cases in which our saving is going to involve infringing people's rights. So there's a famous case by Joel Feinberg in which there's a hiker who's lost in the woods and there's a storm coming in and he's going to freeze to death unless he breaks into this log cabin that he finds. But it's not his log cabin. Now most people think that he's permitted, justified to break in to the log cabin, even though this is going to infringe someone's property rights. Now, if we imagine a variation on this case, and we imagine the hiker he sort of crawls to the porch, but he just doesn't quite make it in, right? And so a second hiker comes along and finds him slumped by the door. Now, it seems to me that it's clearly impermissible for the second hiker to decide she's just going to leave him there because she would prefer not to infringe anybody's property rights. Rather, it seems pretty obvious that she's required to break into the cabin on the first hiker's behalf and pull him inside in order to save his life. Doing so imposes no great burden on her, and it violates nobody's rights. In such circumstances, she has a duty to save, not a mere permission. Now, given this, unless saving the 5 in the trolley case imposes too great a cost on pedestrian, she must be required to save them. If, however, saving the 5 would impose a sufficiently great cost on pedestrian, it would be a mistake to think that diverting is the lesser evil. If pedestrian is permitted to refrain, it must be because the total harm that she will inflict, including the harm that she will inflict on herself, the cost to herself, is not sufficiently outweighed by the good that she can secure to produce a lesser evil justification. So in such cases, as I'll argue, the lesser evil justification only obtains if pedestrian consents to bear the cost that's demanded of it. Now, it might seem that the requirement thesis is quickly shown to be false by thinking about the following sort of case, which we'll call grenade. All right, so attacker is going to kill victim with his hammer. Now, victim can defend himself because luckily he's got a grenade that he can throw at attacker that's going to kill him. Very convenient. However, inconveniently, neighbour is sort of wandering past and the blast from the grenade is going to inflict moderate burns on her. She's an innocent person. So that would be a side effect that the victim can't avoid if he decides to throw the grenade. Now, it seems plausible in this case that victim has a lesser evil justification for defending himself, even foreseeing the moderate harm that he's going to cause neighbour. But it also seems plausible that victim doesn't have to defend himself. Rather, he's permitted to choose to let himself be killed, if he likes, rather than harm neighbour. Thus, the requirement thesis looks false in cases where one has a lesser evil justification for saving oneself. I can see Mark's nodding, but, there's more.
Okay, yeah.
So I think that we can defend the requirement thesis against this objection by noticing that there's a difference between cases in which whether a lesser evil justification obtains depends on an agent's preferences, and cases in which a lesser evil justification obtains despite the agent's preferences. So when victim's deciding whether or not he wants to defend himself in grenade, I think he can decide, if he wants to discount the harm to himself, and this will affect whether or not there's a lesser evil justification for harming neighbour. So a colleague of mine at Stockholm, Jonathan Parry, has defended a similar view with regards to refusing consent to being rescued. So what Jonathan's got in mind are cases of humanitarian intervention. Right? One of the conditions that philosophers often stipulate when we think about intervention is do the people in the country in which we're thinking of intervening want us there, right? Have they consented to being rescued? Do they want the Americans to come and help them? And the answer to this question might be no, right? They might want to refuse their consent in these cases to being rescued. Now, if we think consent matters, we want to have some kind of story about what happens when people refuse their consent to being rescued, especially if it's just some members of the group who don't want to be rescued, but some of the others do. Now, Parry suggests that when a person refuses her consent to being rescued, she removes her interest from the kind of the pot of goods that the rescuer may take into account when judging the proportionality of the rescue. So, for example, imagine in the original Trolley case, 2 of the 5 don't want workmen to be killed as a side effect of saving their lives, right? So this could be, perhaps they're pacifists, right? It could be religious reasons. They just don't want workmen to be harmed for their benefit. Now, if they refuse their consent to being rescued, Parry argues that then we can only weigh the saving of the remaining 3 people who want to be rescued, against the killing of workmen. Now, if 3 lives are not enough to justify killing workmen, then rescuing the 5 will be impermissible. So Parry's thought here is that people have control over their own good, such that they can refuse to have their interests taken into account as part of a justification for harming. Now, unlike Parry, I don't think that the rescuer's interests get wholly eradicated from the proportionality calculation. I think there's still some value in saving people, even if they don't want to be saved. We could imagine a case in which, say, all 5 refuse their consent, but they do so even though the trolley is just going to kind of lightly brush against workman's leg or something, leaving a small bruise. Now, we might think in that case, look, they may be refusing their consent, but there's still value in those 5 lives, and so we still get to divert the trolley. So I think that their lives still matter. But I also think that when they refuse consent, it certainly has a significant effect on the proportionality calculation and on the weighing of goods and harms. And I think we can say something similar about what happens if victim, in a case like Grenade, doesn't want to harm neighbour for the sake of saving himself. He effectively removes or very heavily discounts his own interests from the weighing of goods and harms. And once we remove his interests, saving him will not outweigh the harm done to neighbour, because there's nothing to outweigh then the harm that's done to neighbour. So therefore we no longer have a lesser evil justification. And that explains why he's not required to act. So this is a case in which victim controls whether or not the lesser evil justification obtains. It's not a case in which he can simply decide whether or not to act on a lesser evil justification that obtains independently of his preferences. I think that thinking about cases of self-defense can also help us to understand cases of supererogatory sacrifice. So if we take a case like legs, this is a slightly gruesome case, I'm afraid. Now, pedestrian can divert the trolley, killing workmen and saving the 5. But she can do it only by pushing the trolley down the side tracks toward workmen. She has to sort of kick it, right? So she has to step onto the tracks, and then she gets electrocuted. That's what the lightning bolt symbolises. And she's going to permanently lose the use of her legs, right? So it's a really significant harm. But then she'll save the 5, and workmen will be killed. Now, let's say that pedestrian isn't required to inflict the loss of the use of her legs on herself, right? That's too much of a harm for us to say that she has to bear it, and so she isn't required to divert the trolley. Nonetheless, it seems like pedestrian is permitted to divert. She could make a supererogatory sacrifice of her legs for the good of the 5. She could decide to do that. It'd be really nice. But we might say she's permitted to do that, right? She's permitted to divert only because there's a lesser evil justification for killing the 1. And so the legs case looks like a case in which she's permitted but not required to act on a lesser evil justification. Now here too, I think that if pedestrian doesn't consent to inflicting the loss of the use of her legs on herself, there is no lesser evil justification for diverting the trolley. If we're granting that inflicting the loss of her legs on herself is, objectively, such a great cost that she doesn't have to do it, the balance of objective reasons cannot be such that achieving the good outweighs the harms that will be inflicted. But if pedestrian consents to bear this cost, she removes or discounts the harms to herself in the weighing of the goods and harms. Again, we get a balance of the objective reasons in favour of diverting, so a lesser evil justification for diverting, but only if pedestrian consents to make the supererogatory sacrifice. Now, it might seem like this kind of reliance on pedestrians' consent results in a funny kind of duty or a funny kind of requirement, because the existence of her requirement to act depends on her first doing what's supererogatory, right? And that seems a bit strange. It's like she has to agree to have the duty, and we don't normally think of duties as being like that. They're sort of imposed upon us externally. But it's not always true that, or at least it's sometimes true that duties can be kind of conditional in this way. So take a case like kitten trolley. Now this case makes me really sad, as you'll see why. So there's 2 runaway trolleys. They're heading down parallel tracks, all right? Now 5 people are trapped on track A on the left there, and it's got a side track where you can send the trolley down to a workman's trap. Now on the other track, track B, there's a kitten that's going to be hit by the trolley, but it's also got a side track which is empty, so you can just send it down there and save the kitten. Now pedestrian's in the middle. She's only got time to divert 1 trolley. But she can do so only again by pushing the trolley with her legs. It's going to electrocute her again and result in a loss of her legs. Loss of the use of her legs. Now assume again that pedestrian is not required to electrocute herself in this way in order to save the 5. If so, then according to me, the objective balance of reasons doesn't produce a lesser evil justification because the cost to pedestrian is too high. However, as before, she can choose to omit her own interests from the balancing of the objective reasons, such that the remaining reasons do generate a lesser evil justification for harming workmen, just as in the legs case. Now, if there were no requirement to act on lesser evil justifications that arise only when the agent consents to bear the harm, we could not explain why it's impermissible for pedestrian to save the kitten. She would be permitted to refrain from saving the 5, and if she's permitted to do that, there's no reason why she can't save the kitten. Presumably she can do what she likes with her time. And yet it clearly is, sadly, impermissible to save the kitten. When she opts to set her own interests aside, right, if she's going to electrocute herself, she has to then act on the balance of the remaining moral reasons. And this seems equally true when there's no kitten to save, right? It could hardly be the wrongness of saving kittens that somehow generated a requirement to save the 5. If acting to save the 5 is required once pedestrian consents to sacrifice her own interest in the kitten trolley case, it must be similarly required in the trolley case. Now notice that we're assuming here that pedestrian is not required to inflict the loss of her legs on herself, even though she's permitted to kill workmen without his consent. And if this is true, it must be because it's somehow especially demanding to require an agent to inflict harm on herself. And that's an interesting idea, and it's an idea I'm going to come back to later. So, I think the most convincing arguments in favour of the permissibility thesis are likely to invoke pedestrian's autonomy as an explanation of why she's allowed to refuse to divert the trolley. And this is an idea that Alec Wallen and David Wasserman have put forward recently, arguing that we have to leave killing workmen to pedestrians' discretion. So they argue that rival explanations of the trolley problem erroneously treat pedestrian as a kind of a mere node for mediating the claims of others, neglecting the fact that pedestrian has claimed not to act in ways that she doesn't want to act. So they suggest that the key to understanding and resolving trolley cases lies in recognising the competing claims of workmen on the one hand, the 5 as well, as being sort of potential victims of, or beneficiaries of pedestrians' actions, but along with pedestrians' own claims. So the 5 have positive claims to be saved, workman has a negative claim not to be killed, and most accounts of the trolley problem just weigh these 2 sets of claims against each other. And Wallen and Wasserman grant that if those were the only relevant claims, then pedestrian would indeed be required to divert the trolley. But they say things turn out differently when we also factor in pedestrian's negative claim to refrain from doing things that she doesn't want to do, right, once we take into account her preferences. So they say that pedestrian has a substantial interest in not having to be an agent of death. That interest expresses itself in her having a substantial negative agent claim not to be required to turn the trolley onto the one. Since diverting the trolley would make pedestrian an agent of workman's death, they say it makes sense that her negative agent claim is strong enough to give her the freedom not to do what the balance of the patient claims would call for her to do. Now, negative agent claims have this kind of strength, they say, because they serve to protect an agent from having to treat herself as a mere tool for the promotion of the general welfare. Now, they think the pedestrian can waive the claim that protects this interest, and she can choose to divert if she wants to, but they say she can also rely on that claim in order to ground a right not to have to kill workmen. So this is an interesting idea, and I think it's probably quite a popular idea. I think this is what motivates a lot of the people's belief that pedestrian doesn't have to divert the trolley. So what kind of interest is this? Well, there seem to be some interests that we have independently of our preferences, such as interests in avoiding physical harm. Now, people will disagree about the range of these objective interests, so some people will think it's objectively in my interest to read certain books and watch certain plays and view certain works of art and so on. Other people might restrict the range of objective interests to something quite narrow, say kind of the things I need for a minimally decent life or something like that. Now, Wallen and Wasserman seem to envisage our interest in not being agents of death as belonging to this set of kind of objective, preference-independent interests. Because they assert without argument that we all have this kind of interest, even though it's clearly true that people's preferences with regard to killing vary, right? Some people quite like killing, some people don't mind it that much. And nonetheless, they think that everybody has an interest in not being an agent of death. Now, they say that we can waive the claim that protects this interest if we like, right? I can choose to divert the trolley, but they don't say that the interest itself depends on an agent's preferences. That seems to be something that's kind of objective. Now, I think it's false that an interest in not being an agent of death could be this source of objective interest. Killing someone is clearly not bad for my interests in the way that physical harms, for example, are bad for my interests. And I think acts of killing and people's responses to them seem just far too varied for us to make any general claim about the impact of killing on a person's capacity to shape or enjoy her life in a more kind of abstract sense. Some killings are courageous or heroic, others are mundane or institutionalized. It's perfectly possible that someone might have a career as a police sniper or a state executioner, for example, without that impeding her ability to have a good life. So in order to sustain the idea that we each have a kind of objective, preference-independent interest in not being agents of death, I think we'd have to show that this is a kind of moral interest. Now, if we assume, it seems quite plausible, that we all have an interest in living a morally good life, whether we want to or not, right? So that other things being equal, a life in which I don't rape or steal and so on is better for me than a life in which I do those things, then showing that we have a moral interest in not being agents of death would support Wallen and Wasserman's view. But I don't think it's true that we each have a moral interest in not being agents of death. It's clearly false that killing is always morally wrong, and it's pretty plausible that killing is sometimes morally required. So someone, for example, who refused to lethally defend a child from an attack, especially her own child, would be doing something seriously morally wrong. Someone who refused to divert the trolley away from 100 people towards one or 1,000 people towards one would also be doing something seriously morally wrong. So whilst we have, I think, a clear moral interest in refraining from unjustified killing, we have no similar interest in refraining from justified killings. And I think we can say something similar about the idea that it's morally good to sort of cultivate an aversion to killing. An aversion to unjust killing is certainly something that we should all cultivate an aversion to, but there's no reason why we should extend this aversion to killing in general. Furthermore, even if we grant that we have moral interests in refraining from killing in general, just or unjust, we must surely also grant that we have moral interests in preventing harm. Now, of course, most people think that these interests don't weigh as heavily as our interest in refraining from killing, right? Most people think it's worse to kill someone than to fail to save someone's life. But surely the strength of our moral interest in avoiding killing has to track the moral value of killing. And the strength of our moral interest in preventing harm would have to track the moral value of preventing harm. Now, if so, the balance of these interests in Trolley would favour diverting, even granting the greater importance of avoiding being an agent of death, since by hypothesis the interests of the 5 outweigh the killing of workmen. It would be really strange to think that the reasons for saving the 5 in Trolley outweighed the reasons against killing workmen, such that killing him is required if we ignore pedestrians' preferences or our interests. but that pedestrians' interest in saving 5 lives doesn't outweigh her interest in not killing workmen. So it seems like the greater compromise of pedestrians' moral interests, understood as an interest in acting in accordance with the balance of moral reasons, would be failing to divert the trolley. Now, something that I think is worth noticing is that if we deny that this is how the reasons balance out, and we hold that pedestrians' interest in not being an agent of death somehow outweighs her interest in saving the 5, then we'd really be at a loss to explain the permissibility of diverting. The idea of waiving a claim that protects my interest doesn't apply when it's a claim to act in accordance with the balance of moral reasons. In such cases, I have a claim to act because I have a duty to act, and I can't waive my moral duties. So I think that the idea of an interest in not being an agent of death as a kind of objective preference-independent interest, or even as a moral interest, looks quite unpromising. But I do think it's plausible that we can have what I call bare autonomy interests. So most of us think that there's objective value, objective moral value, in letting people try to shape their own lives and pursue their own freely chosen ends. And I expect that it's this kind of interest that many people have in mind when they say that pedestrian may choose not to divert the trolley, right? So the thought would be something like, look, pedestrian gets to decide whether her life is one that involves being an agent of death, or perhaps more specifically, whether her life is one that involves being the agent of workman's death, right? She gets to decide whether or not she kills people. Now, the difficulty with this argument is that the scope of the ends that I'm allowed to adopt for myself, and when and how I may pursue those ends, is constrained by my objective moral duties. And so it won't do to simply observe that anyone who doesn't want to divert the trolley has chosen to try to shape her life in a way that doesn't involve killing workmen, any more than it would do to observe that anyone who doesn't want to pull a drowning child out of a pond has chosen to shape her life in a way that doesn't involve rescuing children. When an interest has moral value solely in virtue of being a part of how you've chosen to shape your life, the importance of the interest and the stringency of our obligations to let you pursue that interest plausibly tracks the extent to which compromising the interest will affect your capacity to shape your life. If requiring you to act will significantly compromise your capacity to shape your life, then I think we may impose such a requirement only if the moral good at stake is very important indeed. But if requiring you to act will have little impact on your capacity to shape your life, I think we can impose such requirements for less important goods. However, compromising in your autonomy in this way will, just like the killing of workmen, be justified as the lesser evil, right? So we still need significant disparity between the good we can accomplish and the harm that we'll do to your autonomy before we can require you to act. So it's not like you'd have to act every time you could bring about a bit more good. It would only be in cases in which there's significant disparity between the cost to your autonomy and the good that you can secure. Now, it seems obvious that agents are clearly sometimes required to compromise their autonomy interests for the benefits of others. And if this is what it means to make someone treat herself as a tool, it follows that making people treat themselves as tools is permissible. So this includes requiring agents to cause harm to innocent people, even if they would prefer not to. So if we imagine that diverting the trolley would break both of Workman's legs, say, rather than kill him, pedestrians surely can't invoke a negative agent claim to refrain from breaking people's legs in order to justify failing to save 5 people's lives. Even if she's adopted an end for herself of not causing harm to people, and even if she tries to shape her life accordingly, the compromising of her interest just gets outweighed by the good that she can secure for the 5. Now, given this, the issue at hand is not whether requiring someone is not whether we're permitted to require people to compromise their own interests. It's simply under what circumstances can we do so. So what we want to know is whether requiring someone to be an agent of death is a sufficiently serious impeding of her capacity to shape her life that we cannot impose this kind of requirement, or that we can do it only very rarely. Now, obviously, it's trivially true if a person has adopted for herself the end of not killing anybody. Making her kill someone will make it impossible for her to shape her life in that way. But the same would be true of someone who's adopted an end for herself of not saving drowning children. And I doubt we'd be much swayed by the argument in that case, right? You have to save drowning children whether you want to or not. So the question is not whether it makes it impossible for her to pursue any particular one end that she might have chosen for herself, but whether a requirement to act in a given case will restrict her ability to shape her life in a more general way. So compare the trolley case with this case, enlisting. Sorry, I haven't got a picture because it's just too hard to draw. So Sarah's deciding on her future career. Now she can enlist in the military, where she will, over the course of a 10-year career, contribute to the collateral killing of 10 innocent people. However, she'll also contribute to the saving of 50 civilian lives. But Sarah doesn't want to join the military. She wants to be a painter, even though she will not be a very good one. Now, in this case, the ratio between the number of lives saved and the number of people killed is the same as in the trolley, right? It's 5 to 1. But what's different is the cost to Sarah compared to the cost to pedestrian. Requiring Sarah to join the military would very significantly restrict her ability to pursue her own ends. The objection to a requirement to enlist is not that we'll be requiring Sarah to be an agent of death, but that by making her enlist, we drastically restrict the sphere in which she gets to shape her own life. Now, it seems plausible to me that Sarah can refuse to join the military. Enlisting is so costly to her that doing so is supererogatory. But it doesn't seem plausible to me to think that turning the trolley imposes anything like a comparable cost on pedestrian. Indeed, it's not clear that requiring pedestrian to divert when doing so will kill workmen is any more of an incursion into her autonomy than requiring her to divert will cause her to, say, break workmen's legs. When acting to prevent harm is just a one-off action that requires little or moderate effort, I think it has only a minimal impact on a person's capacity to shape her life. Now, such a low cost to pedestrian could defeat a requirement to act only when things are very finely balanced between the other goods and harm, so only in cases where the lesser evil justification just obtains. Now, there must come a point at which this is true, right? There must become a point at which the goods and the harms are finely balanced in this way. However, in these cases, given that things are so finely balanced, cases like this don't undermine the requirement thesis because they amount to a claim that acting is no longer the lesser evil. Lesser evil justifications weigh the good that one can secure against the harm that one will inflict, and this includes the harm that the rescuer would have to inflict on herself. Right? So it includes the cost to pedestrian's autonomy. Now, where the addition of the harm to pedestrian tips the balance, right, the cost of her autonomy is so great that now we no longer have enough good to justify inflicting those harms. That means we no longer have a lesser evil justification. But as soon as the goods and the harms are not finely balanced, once we've got greater disparity, this low cost to pedestrian isn't going to be enough to defeat a requirement to act. So imagine that things are finely balanced in trolley. Let's stipulate that 5 lives is just enough good to make it permissible to justify killing workmen. If the 5 had access to a switch, they would be justified in diverting the trolley themselves, even though they will thereby force workmen to bear a lethal cost. Now imagine that only pedestrian can divert the trolley, but there are 6 people who will be saved if she does so. There's 6 people on the track. Now, as I suggested earlier, it does seem that making someone treat herself as a tool, forcing her to compromise her own interests for the sake of others, is harder to justify than straightforwardly compromising her interests oneself. But even recognising that a requirement like that is harder to justify, there are nonetheless cases in which such a requirement obtains. However substantial an interest pedestrian has in not being a killer, it's surely not as substantial as the 6th person's interest in not being allowed to die. The preventing of this lethal harm must weigh much more heavily in our calculation than the compromising of pedestrians' autonomy. It would be a very odd ranking of interests to believe that the 5 have rights of defence despite the killing of workmen, but that the 6 would lack rights to be saved because of pedestrians' autonomy. It's okay, I haven't actually swallowed a fly. Just checking. Now, what if pedestrian is so committed to not harming that killing workmen will actually cause her serious psychological harm, right? So much so that it will significantly affect her ability to shape her life in accordance with her own freely chosen ends. I think if that's true, then it may be that she's not required to divert the trolley. But I also think that if the cost is so great that it defeats the requirement to act, then diverting the trolley is no longer the lesser evil. The cost to pedestrian gets factored into the harm side of the equation along with the killing of workmen. if the harm to her is bad enough, then there won't be enough disparity between the goods and the harms to make diverting the lesser evil. So what that means is that this might not be a hard and fast rule for every person. Right? It depends on what it would be for the cost to that person, whether or not there's a lesser evil justification, and therefore whether or not they're required to divert the trolley. But I think for most people it's not like that. I don't think it would be such an enormous psychological cost that they wouldn't have to divert. Okay, so this is the final section on the handout. If it's true, as I've suggested, that pedestrian is morally required to divert the trolley, what does this mean for workman's right of self-defence? Because as you know, we've forgotten, we haven't talked much about workman, but let's not forget that he's really bearing the brunt of this argument. So here are 3 ways in which workman might defend himself against being killed by the trolley. So we can call the first one early grenade. Now, in this case, workman, so the trolley is still at the sort of the top of the tracks. It hasn't been diverted yet. Now, workman throws a grenade at the switch to prevent pedestrian from flipping the switch, and then the blast kills pedestrian as a side effect. And then, of course, the 5 are killed by the trolley because the trolley hasn't been diverted. Then we could have a case we can call late grenade. Now, in this case, pedestrian has already diverted the trolley, so the 5 are saved. It's already heading down towards workman. And now workman can destroy the trolley by throwing a grenade at the trolley. But again, pedestrian gets killed as a side effect. So in this case, the 5 will survive. Right, they're now okay, but pedestrian will still be killed. And then we can have a third case. This is called jamming. Now, in this case, there is no grenade. Rather, workman's got a remote jamming device that he can use to prevent the switch from being flipped. And in this case, pedestrian's unable to divert the trolley, and so the 5 are killed. So there's no harm to pedestrian in this case. He simply prevents the diverting of the trolley in order to save his own life, but at the cost that the 5 will die. Now, I think it's impermissible for workman to defend himself in both early grenade and late grenade. So in the cases in which he's going to harm pedestrian. Pedestrian has no duty not to divert the trolley, and this is true even if you think diverting is merely permissible, right? So even if you don't buy the requirement thesis, you still think, if you think it's permissible for her to divert, that she has no duty not to divert. And following Victor Tadros's work, I think that when there's no lesser evil justification for harming, defensive force is permissible only if it's a way of getting people to comply with their duties, right? So when I try and stab Mark in the neck, and he defends himself against me, he's trying to get me to comply with my duty not to kill him. That explains why he's allowed to use force against me. So if that's right, if self-defense is grounded in getting people to comply with their duties, and if pedestrian had no duty not to divert the trolley, she hasn't done anything, there's no duty here that he can force her to comply with that she's failing in, it looks like defensive force against pedestrian must be impermissible. Now, we might reply that once pedestrians diverted the trolley in the late grenade case, this is a case that's then best understood in terms of who should bear the cost of the rescue. And there's no reason why those costs should fall on workmen rather than on pedestrian. Invoking the distinction between killing and letting die won't help here because each is going to kill the other, right? So pedestrian's going to kill workman because she sent the trolley in his direction. If he throws the grenade, he's going to kill her. So we might say something like, well, look, perhaps workman's permitted to make pedestrian bear the cost of the rescue, especially if, for example, if he does so only after a fair procedure, right? So maybe he tosses a coin to give them both a fair chance of survival, but if she loses, then it's grenade time. Now, we might support this kind of interpretation of the case by describing pedestrian as a kind of innocent threat to workman, right? She hasn't done anything wrong, but nonetheless, she is going to kill him. And I've argued elsewhere at great length that sometimes you can kill innocent people in self-defense. But even when it comes to innocent threats, the permissibility of using defensive force is still, I think, partly explained by the fact that even innocent people have duties not to harm others, and so when you use force against them, you're allowed to make them bear costs in order to comply with those duties. But again, by hypothesis, pedestrian had no such duty not to harm workmen in trolley. So killing pedestrian still doesn't make her comply with a duty. Rather, it seems to me killing pedestrian is just more like killing a bystander who's under no duty to bear serious costs to save workman's life. So I don't think it would be permissible to toss a coin to decide whether or not to save your life or a bystander's life. If the trolley's heading for you, and you can divert it down a side track, it's just you on your own if you don't have friends. And then there's just one person on the other track. I don't think you get to toss a coin to see whether or not you're going to kill that person to save your life. In a case where it's just your life or one bystander, I think you just have to suffer the harm. Now, if that's true, then it looks like it's going to be impermissible in Lake Grenade to use defensive force against pedestrian, because that would just be like killing a bystander who doesn't have to bear this kind of cost. But I do think, and I think that people who endorse the permissibility thesis can endorse these claims as well. But where I think the permissibility thesis and requirement thesis come apart is in a case like jamming. So I think this is the interesting case. Here, workman's going to prevent the saving of the 5 in a way that doesn't harm pedestrian. Now, the requirement thesis holds that by jamming the switch, workman will prevent pedestrian from doing what she has an objectively justified duty to do. And I don't think we can hold both that there's an objective duty to divert the trolley and that workman may nonetheless prevent the trolleys being diverted. Now, can the cost to workman of having to sort of let himself be killed play a similar role to the cost to pedestrian of being required to harm herself or compromise her own autonomy, such that we might say it's supererogatory for workman to let himself be killed? I think that if we can make this move, then we have to again conclude that given the cost to workman of requiring him to refrain from defending himself, there is no lesser evil justification for diverting when workman can jam the switch. The balance of objective moral reasons cannot both require pedestrian to divert and permit workman to prevent her from diverting. Right? The same reasons apply to both of them equally. And so it can't be the case that she gets to do this and he gets to try to stop her. Now, most philosophers who work on self-defense agree that there can be cases in which we're required to let ourselves be killed. So, for example, if Mark's only means of defense against me when I try and stab him in the neck is a grenade that's going to kill 10 people along with me, then the fact that he's only got disproportionate means of defense available to him makes it impermissible for him to defend himself. He just has to let me stab him in the neck because he has no permissible means of self-defense. So it's not a particularly strange thought to think that we sometimes have to let ourselves be killed. However, by jamming the switch, workman doesn't inflict any harm on the 5. If Mark throws a grenade that kills 10 people, then he's clearly inflicted harm on them. But in the case where he just stops the trolley from being diverted, workman doesn't actually harm the 5, he just prevents them from being saved. Now, Jeff McMahon has argued that the harms we fail to prevent count for less in our proportionality calculations compared to harms that we directly inflict. And he supports this with the following case, surgery. Now, surgeon, who is obviously the one with the creepy mask, is trying to unjustly kill victim with an unrealistically large spanner. He will succeed unless victim kills him. Now, but if victim kills surgeon, then the 5 sick patients on whom surgeon is scheduled to operate next week will all die. There's no one else who can do their surgery. Now, it seems clearly permissible for victim to kill surgeon in self-defense. He doesn't have to let surgeon kill him on the grounds that surgeon's going to carry out these wonderful operations next week. Now, if that's true, if killing surgeon is permissible, then it can't be disproportionate. And McMahon says, well, similarly, it's not disproportionate for victim to save his own life in trolley at the cost of failing to save the 5. McMahon argues that if workman's not required to sacrifice himself for the 5, so if he wouldn't have to turn the trolley towards himself, he may defend himself in a way that prevents the trolleys being turned, even if it means that the 5 will die. But, as I suggested already, it seems that we have to grant that causing harm to oneself is worse than being harmed by others. This explains why pedestrian doesn't have to sacrifice the use of her legs in the legs case when there's all the blood and electrocution and so on, even though it seems like she's allowed to kill workmen. So she can impose a lethal cost on someone else, but she doesn't have to impose a less than lethal cost on herself. Now, if this is right, it won't follow from the fact that workman is not required to sacrifice himself that he's permitted to prevent the trolleys being turned. If workman diverts the trolley towards himself, he's killing himself. That would be hard to do. But if workman does not prevent pedestrian from diverting the trolley, he is letting himself be killed. Now, I agree with McMahon that it's permissible and therefore proportionate for workman to save his own life, for victim to save his own life at the cost of the 5 lives in the surgery case. But it surely makes a difference that in the surgery case, victims preventing an unjustified killing, right? Surgeon's going to violate his rights. Preventing this unjustified killing is the good that gets weighed against the harm of failing to save the 5 patients. Now, I've argued that the 5 in Trolley have a right to be saved if saving them doesn't involve violating anybody's rights. But in the surgery case, the saving of the 5 is now conditional on victim's right being violated. They need him to let himself be murdered if they are to be saved. But in the Trolley case, in contrast, workman's going to prevent one justified killing of himself at the cost of preventing the saving of the 5. Now, it seems to me that unjustified killings weigh more heavily than justified killings in our proportionality calculations. Now, if this is correct, the fact that victim's defence in surgery is proportionate can't show that workman's defence in Trolley is proportionate. Workman's not stopping anybody from being wronged. And since saving the 5 doesn't violate victim's rights, workman's rights, because his death is the lesser evil, I think the 5 have a right that he refrained from jamming the switch. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. Lesser evil justifications play a central role in the ethics of war, and in some accounts of the ethics of self-defence. And yet our treatment of these justifications compared to the various, as Mark waved around, book-length treatments on liability, consent, punishment, desert, all of these things, all these justifications for harming have received a lot of attention. But our treatments of lesser evil justifications is still very hand-wavy. We just sort of say, oh, greater good. So this paper is the beginning of an attempt to say something more concrete about these justifications. And I focus here on what seems to me to be this tension between describing lesser evil justifications as objective justifications that track the moral facts, and yet granting that agents may refrain from acting on these justifications. And I've explored this tension in the context of individual cases of self-defence and other defence. But if it's true, the requirement thesis will also have significant implications for our understanding of war. This will be true even for those people who don't, as I think, try to understand war as basically self-defence writ large. So I understand war in terms of individual rights and duties. Some people reject that view, they think it's about collectives and states, and it's all very different. But nonetheless, they still think that there are lesser evil justifications at play in war. Right? The collateral killing of innocent civilians are justified as the lesser evil by both people in the reductivist camp like me and people in the exceptionalist camp like Michael Walzer, who think that war is morally special. Now, since war inevitably involves collateral killings, it looks as if one could satisfy the conditions for resorting to war only if war itself is the lesser evil. So one implication of the requirement thesis then is going to be that just wars are not merely permissible but also obligatory. And now that's always struck me as a fairly plausible view, actually. It seems to me you shouldn't fight a war unless you really have to. But if you really have to, then you probably should fight it. So I don't see that as a reason to be sceptical of the requirement thesis, but it's just one way in how we construct these lesser evil justifications is going to inform our wider theories about harming, but also very much our theories about the permissibility of harming in war and other kind of large-scale cases. All right, I'm done.